Happy New Year. We hope you had a very Merry Christmas indeed. It's good to be back. Welcome back to the programme. This is a New Culture Forum show where we do our best, as you know, to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. I'm Harrison Pitt, a contributing editor at the European Conservative magazine, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, Sam Bidwell, director of the Next Generation Centre at the Adam Smith Institute, and increasingly prolific, I think it's fair to say, on X, in exposing the many failures of the British state. Sam, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
The most craven, unforgivable of those failures in recent years has probably been the unwillingness of public officials to confront and to address at scale what we're going to call euphemistically the grooming gangs. Of course, it's probably more proper that they should be called the industrial rape and torture gangs, but we're not going to use that word too much because YouTube will censor it in the algorithm. So we are going to call them grooming gangs. But this has probably been the most intractable state failure that's occurred in the last 25 years, predominantly at the hands of Pakistani males engaging in the abuse of white working class women. Do you think that the legitimacy of the British state is in question owing to this monumental scandal?
Absolutely. And I think what is particularly egregious about this scandal in particular is the extent to which it touches every area of public life. So we see police cover-ups. This happens on a semi-regular basis now because of the difficulties that we've had in managing crime over the last couple of decades and the difficulties we've had in managing integration and immigration. We see problems with police officers on a fairly regular basis. But the difference here is that across a number of forces unrelated to one another, we saw the cover-up, the minimisation, often the demonisation of victims of grooming gangs. It's not just the police, it's also the judiciary, it's the teaching profession, it's social workers, it's local politicians and national politicians. It cuts across every level of the state, every organ of the state. And so we might reasonably suggest that this calls into question not just the ability of the British state to handle the issues that we're talking about, but also its legitimacy in doing so.
Indeed, and I suppose if we were to regard the two main sources of legitimacy, there are many, but particularly in democracy, one of them is popular sovereignty, the idea that, broadly speaking, the consent of the governed is operative in the formation of public policy. A lot of these evils are preventable evils. We're talking about an imported diaspora here who have no long established presence in these islands, and that British people were never consulted on whether they wanted to be subjected to the kinds of levels of replacement migration which have enabled this scandal to happen at scale. So that would be the first way in which...
Well, it's actually worse than never been consulted. They were consulted. And at every election since 1974, they said no. The people in politics love to play this game where they say, well, we were never asked and it just sort of happened. We were asleep at the wheel. There was no deliberate effort to continue this policy against public wishes. This is demonstrably untrue because every single election since 1974, the winning manifesto promised to lower migration. People voted for that time and time again. You cannot say that this is not the settled will of the people.
And so that's one way in which the popular sovereignty input into legitimacy is being completely ignored. And then secondarily, you would assume that the state has a bare minimum responsibility to provide a bare minimum of protection for the individual and for their families, and this is clearly being disregarded as well. So, I mean, what is left to count against the British state being illegitimate at the moment?
Oh, well, it's inertia, basically. What we have is inertia. And primarily a media establishment which is unwilling to ask that sort of question. So you will note that even as this issue has come back to prominence, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about why it's come back to prominence in a moment, we've seen, while online media and new media figures have been very, very robust in calling out what is not just a sort of state-enabled horror, but actually state illegitimacy, we've seen at the same time mass media figures close ranks around the political class. So the political legitimacy enjoyed by the British state at the moment is more akin to the kind of legitimacy which you would have ascribed to communist states in the late 1980s, right? Ceausescu's regime in Romania or Honecker in East Germany. It's a state which kind of gestures in the direction of a previous popular mandate and uses power to ensure that it can't be removed or changed.
Yeah, the Soviet comparison is very apt because George F. Kennan, who was JFK's ambassador to Yugoslavia, wrote very eloquently titled The Sources of Soviet Conduct. And he said one of the ways that the Soviet Union maintained absolute repressive power within their country, despite the atrocities visited on their people, was to pose the ever-present threat of external capitalist conspiring forces seeking to tear the revolution asunder. So we need to preserve the dictatorship of the proletariat, the ability to purge anti-revolutionary elements within the country because there are anti-revolutionary elements outside the country. And this is exactly the position that the likes of Keir Starmer and Jess Phillips and Sky News and the BBC and that have taken when Elon Musk, whose eyes were drawn to this scandal because of the sharing of an extract from the Oxford trial by Max Tempers in response to, which we'll get onto shortly, your set two with Fraser Nelson over whether or not integration has worked masterfully. Spoiler alert, it hasn't. Elon Musk is now this external threat of foreign interference, which suddenly they care about, not George Soros and the like, but suddenly they care about foreign interference being brought to bear. And now he is being made the issue to distract from the accountability of the state, of the Labour Party, of social workers and the police, and Keir Starmer himself in covering up the scandal for decades.
Well, of course, we also have our own enemy within. Right? We have Tommy Robinson and the broadly construed far right. You can imagine me saying it in Keir Starmer's voice because I'm a little bit ill, so I've got the kind of nasal tone that he treats us to whenever he speaks in public. But we have both the enemy within and the enemy without. Both are used as a means by which to avoid dealing with the issue itself. I mean, Tim Stanley put out a rather punchy Telegraph piece yesterday entitled something akin to Jess Phillips's honour more important to Starmer than child grooming. We'll use euphemistically, child grooming. That is basically what's happened. They're obfuscating a willingness to deal with the issue by referring to Musk, by referring to Robinson, by making it about the rich and powerful, by making it about the kind of far right that is broadly gestured at without ever really being engaged with. And in the same way as you referred to just moments ago, what that allows the state to do is to continue to cling on to the processes that it sees as problem solving. I don't think Starmer is an evil person.
Really?
Well, his acts may be evil and he may be evil by negligence, but I think it's far more boring than that. I don't think he sets out to do many of the things that he does. I think he's a true believer in process. I think he's a true believer in multiculturalism. I think he's a true believer in the threat of the far right. I think he genuinely buys all of these narratives. I think that's largely a product of a cloistered life experience. Whether or not that qualifies as evil is a different philosophical debate. I would probably say no, but others may say yes, and actually the banality of evil is a concept that you might want to refer to in that discussion. I tend to disagree with Hannah Arendt on this. I think that there are states which, throughout history, which have had sincere belief in evil ideas. There are individuals who've had sincere belief in what we might call evil ideas. I don't think Starmer is one of them. But whether you think he's evil or not, he certainly will do anything in his power to protect the processes that he's grown up, not just defending, but inculcated by. He's shaped many of those processes. He is now a defender of those processes.
You know, that ever-present fear of the far right, obviously what you're referring to is on Monday when he said that anyone who is calling for a national inquiry about this, and we can debate the merits of whether or not that's needed, I would think yes, but anyone who is doing that is jumping on a, quote, far-right bandwagon. Now, I like Tim Stanley as well. I think he's very good on matters of theology as one of two Catholics at the table. But Tim is also quite guilty of this because the piece before, that piece on Jess Phillips and Starmer, was congratulating Farage on making an issue out of Robinson because he's constantly asked about it. It must get annoying. But saying we can now step over Robinson's unhealthy obsession with Islam, something that Farage spoke about in 2018. Islam is inextricably bound up with these grooming gangs, so it's not like you can step over it in this story, despite perhaps Robinson's personal failings and objectionable form of doing politics. And it seems like with Starmer, with Tim there a little bit, and with Fraser Nelson in that piece that you were responding to, which ignited this entire international debate, Fraser said, the reason why I've put this piece out smoothing over the cracks of nothing to see here about problems about integration and crime is because the far right is on the rise in Europe and we can't be having that, is it? Are you seeing this impulse to contain being the driving factor behind people wanting to deny the Grooming Gang scandal?
Well, I think so, and I would add to your list Nigel Farage. Farage, one of his proudest achievements by his own admission is his defeat of the BNP as the primary force on the right of British politics. There was a time in 2003, 4, 5 where it looked like the BNP would be a serious force in British politics. There are all sorts of reasons why that's not desirable. Right, I think it was always a hopelessly thuggish, ineffective party that could never have seriously brought about the kind of change that we need to see.
They came out the National Front.
Precisely. So there were very legitimate reasons to oppose the BNP and the National Front and the EDL and all of those groups. They've always been a fairly marginal part of politics up until that moment where it looked like the BNP might have a bit of an electoral breakthrough. People talk about the Battle of Barking. Morgan McSweeney, obviously now part of Starmer's administration, was a figure in, allegedly a figure in defeating the BNP in East London. People will accept or detract from that narrative. I'm a bit of a detractor. I think there are other.
They have their Cable Street myth.
Yeah, precisely. It's the mythos. It's not about the reality. We know the reason that Barking is not a hub for the far right is because Barking is 40% white British. Right? There are no bones to be made about that. But we do know that the mythos is about the BNP, is about the National Front, etc. And it's there for Farage too. Farage cares very deeply about the fact that he's cleaned up ideas to the right of the Conservative Party. What you therefore do when you talk about the far right is you invoke that mythos.
Yep.
You invoke Cable Street, Mosley, you invoke Nick Griffin, you invoke the EDL riots, all that sort of thing, which most respectable people, even if they consider themselves openly anti-immigration, they still wouldn't want to associate with those groups. You try and drive a wedge between the great mass of the public and these groups. The problem, I think, in this particular instance, is that this is so obviously not a far-right idea. And it's, to the extent that the public was aware of the problem, almost everybody is uniformly behind the idea that we need more inquiry, more investigation, firings, deportations, whatever you want to call it. People want more action on this substantively. It is such an obvious overreach to describe this as far-right.
I think as well, another really important point to make there, you're right, what all people on the sort of respectable centre-right of politics do when they approach the issue in those terms is that they're genuflecting to the organising principles and the embedded myths that fuel the regime that allowed this horrific scandal to happen in the first place. And by doing that, all you do is consolidate the apparent legitimacy of that in our public debate rather than shifting the terms of the public debate in a new direction. And one of the reasons why a public inquiry, in my view, would be incredibly effective. Of course, there are the more sort of mundane concerns that we want victims to see justice, we want accountability, we want a spotlight shone on the failings that were made. We want certain public officials to be unemployable for the rest of their lives. We want victims to be able to sue them into penury. We want to deport criminals. So there are all of these sort of nuts and bolts reasons why we want it to get done, but having to do with justice. But another reason why it would be why it's incredibly important, in my view, is that it might generate a new mythos of sorts. I mean, there's a sense in which big public trials, one naturally thinks here of Nuremberg. Like when there's an often unremarked passage in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, where he talks about Nuremberg being the most important act of the 20th century, the most important thing that happened in the 20th century, because it had completely reoriented the political order around a sort of governing philosophy. We're going to stop aggressive wars, and we're going to be preemptively and actively on guard against Nazification, never again, all of this sort of stuff. If we could replicate some of that energy in our own national story, a kind of never again around this, it would completely reorient the political order, and there would become a point where it wouldn't be that very tawdry mythos into which politicians feel duty-bound to buy whenever they speak, to genuflect whenever they speak, but there would be a new one there, and it would serve a much larger meta-political purpose than just giving justice to the victims.
I think that's right. It's worth, just on your first point, noting, let's take that idea to its logical conclusion, the idea that if this were a far-right idea, it would be wrong to interrogate it. Right? That is actually what is being said.
Exactly what's being said, yes.
If when journalists say, Tommy Robinson, and I'm not a fan at all of Tommy Robinson for all sorts of reasons, but if and when a journalist says, because Tommy Robinson was talking about this, respectable journalists were unwilling to. What they are saying is that social capital matters more to them than the grooming of children.
Yes.
That is a crazy idea. If you lay it out in those terms, it sounds plainly immoral. But that is actually what's being said by many figures.
It's exactly what's being said. Yes.
It is therefore worth dismantling, as you say, the mythos that has been built up and replacing it with something far more robust. I don't just write about this issue; I write about a number of other issues as well. And one of the things that I think about when I'm writing, whether it's about integration or even the economy, more pedestrian political issues, the problem is that our political framework as a nation is so obviously broken and wrong, and it needs to be something else. The way in which we think about ourselves, about the nation as a concept, these ideas are all totally incorrect. And I know you've spoken a lot about propositional nationalism on this show. I think increasingly that is something that we need an alternative to. But it all links together. This can't be disaggregated from the way in which we think about this terrible concept of community relations, right, which goes right back to the 1960s. It can't be disaggregated from the way in which we think about quangos and bureaucracy. It can't be disaggregated from the way in which we think about political legitimacy. All of these things are tied up into it, which I think is why it has been such a, I don't want to use the phrase radicalizing, because I don't think you are a radical if you care about this, but it has been such a sobering, catalyzing moment, story, narrative for so many people. I mean, this isn't new as a story,
no,
right? But a great many people that I talk to who are in agreement with me and you and I on some of the issues that we're talking about here often cite reading about Rotherham or Rochdale or Telford as the moment that they started to realise that actually all the things that they'd been fed at school or by parents or by the media were totally wrong, right? So this on a micro level has served as a kind of narrative shifter. It could well do on a macro level if there was some sort of comprehensive and properly administered national inquiry.
Well, a bellwether for that narrative shift is how historian Tom Holland in 2015, when he had heard about it at the time, had said the authorities were conducting this noble goal of ensuring that race relations remained positive, and this is why it was swept under the rug. And when he was pressed about it this time, it coded very differently, and he got a lot of backlash because he doubled down on that idea. And other academics trying to defend him had said that the primary goal of a government is to maintain positive cohesion between communities. Now, I would think that you wouldn't have to have that primary goal if you didn't import said indigestible criminal elements into your country in the first place against the wishes of the native population. But most importantly, linked to that, the idea of social capital, the idea of the new mythos, it is only that in 2015, all the social capital was on the side of burying this story to preserve one's career. I think with the shift in making X, after Elon Musk purchased Twitter, a very laissez-faire public square, bringing these unpopular truths to light, the social capital has now shifted towards, if you are denying this, if you're calling it a far-right bandwagon, you are depriving the molested children of the justice that is their due course. And so this should be a penalty now. And so I'm wondering if it's going to take on the same aspect of denialism as something like the Holocaust, or as I put out a few days ago, as something like October 7th. Because I think at this stage, the public appetite for a response to the grooming gangs is reaching a similar fever pitch to the public appetite for retaliation for October 7th within Israel. And Musk himself liked that tweet when I put it out. So I think that's where the social capital is flowing.
Well, yeah, look, I think that's right. And I think it's not just X and Musk. I think it's that the Overton window has shifted enormously, both for public pressure reasons and also because I think people on this side of politics are starting to become more effective in the way that they communicate their ideas. I think it's part of a broader trend, but certainly there is... we're not living in a monopolar world in which social capital is only derived from the kind of head patting of the BBC or of The Guardian, right? We're moving to more of a kind of, as you say, a laissez-faire world in which there are a number of different sources of social capital. I think you mentioned October 7th. It's worth pointing out that these are not just historic wrongs. This is an ongoing problem that has never been dealt with in full. It is true that as recently, I think, as 2022, we've had new convictions on this issue.
Last year.
Really? Okay, there we go. So even more recently.
Charlie Peters attended the trial in Rotherham where, during the sentencing hearing, the children of the convicted rapists shouted out, knowing what their dads had done, "I love you, Dad," and the families tried to start fights with victims outside the proceedings.
And speaking of media closing ranks in order to protect a political class that they deem as serving their ideological interests, I think Charlie Peters also talked about being the only person in the room at that.
The only
journalist in the room at that trial. Anyway, sorry, Sam.
No. I mean, there we go. Even more recently. I think that story also highlights one of the other reasons that this needs to be a narrative shift, not just a delivery of justice in an individual circumstance.
Yes.
A prison isn't working with these communities, right? The assumptions that we have around justice and prison are based on a society that we no longer exist in which having been to prison will damage your social capital, right? And in which people can be relied upon to judge what you've done, A, to accept what the state has said about what you've done, B, to then apply their own social lens to that, and C, to treat you slightly differently, right? So we may say that, okay, if you're somebody who believes in rehabilitative justice, which is an idea I'm not so sure about, but if you are, that C may be, well, okay, we accept you've been to prison and that you're rehabilitated.
Yeah.
But that's why our criminal justice system builds in ideas like remorse, the concept of remorse, the idea that you should be remorseful, the idea that we can judge whether somebody's rehabilitated by simply what they say rather than what they do. These are institutions built for a homogenous, high-trust society.
And an individual guilt morality rather than a clan-based shame morality.
Precisely. And so what will happen to many of these people who've received jail sentences of in many cases, 2 years, 3 years, which I remind viewers is the same amount of time given to those who posted things on Facebook during the Southport riots in the summer. So under the British state's own morality, those are the same order of wrong. Many of those people will integrate seamlessly back into their communities, right? They will go on. They will go back into the taxi business. They will go back into whatever the family trade is. They will be able to walk the streets. Many of them will continue to play important communal roles.
Like they've just been on holiday.
Right, precisely. It's time away from the community. We know that many of these prisons have an essentially open door policy on things like drugs and phones, so actually you probably haven't really lost contact with your community on the outside either. The current position of prisons in the British state is that we try and put people in prison near to their own communities. Right, so there's no kind of culture camp breaking up of the clans here, right? We're doing precisely the opposite. We're deliberately keeping the clans together. We're not enforcing the rules which would break up people's communication with the outside world, and we're dealing with a group for whom that kind of individual guilt-based morality simply doesn't exist. So why do we imagine that simply putting these people behind bars for a long time would work? Right? Of course it wouldn't. We need a re-mythologizing of what the state is, what the British state is for, and the tools that it uses.
Well, that inability to understand a foreign theory of mind was the entire reason why this conversation got sparked. Because Fraser Nelson, for anyone who wasn't aware, did his final piece in The Telegraph saying that Britain's current path of multiculturalism is a, quote, integration miracle. And despite editing Douglas Murray's column in The Spectator for over 10 years, in which Douglas pointed out that the majority of places in England and Wales police districts have not solved a single burglary in the last 3 years, Fraser Nelson thought, well, crime's going down. Yeah, we can overlook all of the grooming and the rise in stabbings in London, the fact that a RAPE is reported once every hour in London. We can overlook all of that because think of the food. And you responded in kind in The Critic, comparing him to the last Japanese soldier who surrendered 29 years after the Second World War, hiding out in the Filipino jungle, dedicated to a dead cause. I'm wondering if this shows that the penalties for denying these ongoing and historical atrocities are firmly on the side of punishing rather than accruing career security to those who deny them.
I'm always a skeptic of criminalizing or punishing speech or writing. we can go into that discussion.
You mean a social fund,
like
don't you?
But,
Yeah, social
but this is what I was going to
punishment
say is socially, I think it's absolutely critical that we are uncompromising in the way that we address people who hold this position. Tom Holland, you mentioned before. I also replied to Tom Holland.
I think I did too.
I think I think it was.
I think we all ratioed him into the Earth's core at one point.
There we go.
Ratioing is becoming its own form of social capital. I think that's what we're getting at here.
Yeah, there we go. Maybe that's the thesis.
Sorry, Sam, continue.
Yeah, but figures like Tom Holland, figures like Fraser Nelson, their social capital is derived from the people around them. They're not exposed whatsoever to people of alternative views, backgrounds, etc. Right? They live, again, fairly cloistered lives. It should be completely acceptable, A, to disagree with them, and B, to address their priors for the harmful ideas that they are. Right? So, yes, we should say this idea and that idea led to this atrocity. This is the worldview which produces these terrible events. Say that explicitly. Be very outward about that. There's no need to disguise it behind, oh, aren't we all trying to achieve the same thing? Well, actually, no, we're not, like plainly. So that first, Tom Holland breaks down his argument. There's 4 points. First one is the state has a duty to preserve good race relations. I don't agree. He's wrong. And, the good race relations might be preserved by the state performing its other duties, i.e. border control, enforcement of criminal law, harsh sanction against rule breakers, etc. But it shouldn't actively go out and do that. And that was the settled position in this country until the Race Relations Act of the late 1960s. It is fine to say, this is a bad idea. You ought not to be listened to for believing this. And this terrible idea has produced this terrible atrocity. Absolutely.
I think it's also, I do agree with everything you were just saying there, Sam, but I think it's also worth making as an additional point that even if you were to take the preservation of decent race relations as a laudable goal for the state to perform and actively to want to perform, it's not obvious to me that good race relations are secured by allowing an indigestible tribal diaspora in this country to play an outsized role, an overrepresented role in the grooming and torture and of young white working class girls. So there is a sense in which even the use of the term preserving good race relations, in principle, in practice, what it really means is treating certain minority groups as having a stronger claim on the state acting in their interest than the host population itself. So there is an intrinsic anti-white impetus behind that phrase as applied, not necessarily in the abstract, but as applied anyway. So even I think the point is even stronger than how you just made it.
Well, it's a sort of inversion of the Ottoman millet system.
Yes.
Right. So
yes,
the Ottoman millet, the protected class is the majority or the plurality Turk.
Yes.
But there are communal protections for Arabs, Jews, Armenians, etc.
Indeed.
We have a kind of inverse millet where the only group without specific institutions is the majority, right? Which is a totally perverse way of managing, as they call it, community relations.
Of course.
It is worth reflecting on the fact that unfortunately most states which are diverse in racial or religious terms manage things in this way. Right, the best examples that people come up with when they talk about race relations are places like Singapore, which are, of course, heavily managed and have baked in ideas like legislation can't disproportionately affect one ethnic group or another. They deliberately break up housing blocks so that
very aggressive integration.
Very aggressive integration strategy. So,
and also the demographic proportions and demographic makeup in the population are preserved deliberately by law in aspects so that things can't get worse. In other words, they wanted to remain majority Han Chinese. I think that Lee Kuan Yew is even on record saying, if it were 98% Han Chinese, we would be a more successful country. But since we're only 75%, we'll stick to 75%. But we will stick to 75%.
Yeah, precisely. And citizenship is given out on those basis. So they will deliberately go out and solicit a certain number of Chinese, Malay, and Indian citizens a year to freeze these things in amber. So this is, I'm afraid, the norm in societies which choose to make themselves diverse, or many of these societies didn't choose to be diverse. They were diverse already. They were a state applied across a number of settled populations. You see this in the Middle East. You see this in parts of Europe. We are choosing it.
Indeed.
And we are adopting many of the same tools which produce failed states like Bosnia or Lebanon, etc. It's thoroughly depressing. But it's worth, when we talk about people like Tom Holland or Fraser Nelson, recognizing that what they're saying is no different to the kind of brotherhood and unity of Tito. You mentioned Yugoslavia before. These ideas have been discredited before. They've done great harm before. It's worth calling them out as they are.
Well, because they don't have those failed states in mind. They have an airport lounge where everyone speaks business class English and it's very well air conditioned, and you have a buffet of pick and choose, cosmopolitan, global, very clean food. And, oh, that nice chap over there is Indian, and I don't know anything about his personal life, but he seems okay to me. And if he's a good thing, therefore all of them must be a good thing, and therefore infinity Indians. And so they don't envision these failed states. And the one of the tweets that I replied to Fraser with was, have you got public transport in the last few years? Have you visited any of these newly diversified areas like Bromley or Bexley, which are formerly very homogenous boroughs, which have transformed overnight? People can see all of the questionable businesses that I've posted from those high streets over the Christmas period. Have you taken a stroll through Whitechapel anytime recently? I don't think that you'll be decrying that particular Egyptian slum as anything approaching strong. I do wonder if just the deleterious consequences of mass immigration, multiculturalism, are just not made present to these people, and therefore they can afford, being in the luxury belief class, to not first-hand experience the consequences, unlike those white working class children that have had first-hand confrontations with the grooming gangs.
It is very telling. I talk to younger people on the right. Almost none of them are privately educated West London types. Whereas if you talk to regular conservatives, almost all of them are.
Right? Even if they're not conservatives, you mean the respectable conservatives?
Small people who are small C conservative. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a conservative. So people that I would refer to as small C conservatives, establishment conservatives, respectable conservatives.
Usually a bit older.
Precisely. Many of them, even if they're not from that part of the world, they effectively live a similar life, right? They live in a nice bit of the southeast, or they're from one of the few private schools in the southwest, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
It is people from quite boring provincial towns who make up a lot of the new young right. I'm from a former brickmaking town in northeast Wales. Very boring place, very little going on. But two things happen. One is that you witness immigration as an issue that emerges basically organically over your lifetime. So when I was born, there was very little external settlement, right? Our biggest sectarian conflict was between the English and the Welsh, because I'm right on the border. Quite happy to keep that one. That was quite fun. Now we live in a world where actually you're beginning to see the ill effects of immigration in places like Chester or Wrexham, right? Both of which I'm pretty close to when I go back home. You also then go to places like Birmingham and London, you go, what the hell is going on here? Right? This is something's not working here, right? You come at it both as an outsider because you're not from these cities, but as an insider because you belong to the nation state. And you probably, if you have some sort of inclination towards the idea of the nation, you probably feel it. You've read about it, you've experienced it, your parents have told you about it. You have some innate feeling of nation. And you then go to places where that idea is so obviously being ignored. The concept of nation is so obviously been ignored in the way that we've shaped public policy. I therefore basically completely agree. The people who have the luxury of dealing with immigration at the level of the airport lounge, the private school, the Indian immigration is a great argument deployed by people like Fraser Nelson, right? And I have written before that this is actually a slightly mythical positive story. If you control for region, Indian immigrants now actually earn less than the national average because of the recent Boris wave spike in Indian immigration, 1 million Indians over the last 4 years. Just as a historical curio, that's more than the number of Brits who ever went to India during the period of colonization over the whole period.
Oh, and we deliberately kept our proportion in the population down so as not to induce a sense of demographic anxiety among native Indians.
Yeah.
That was a deliberate, I think, quite a charitable policy on our part.
And after the early the early days of the empire, when the company, when the state takes control of managing Britain's Indian possessions.
After the mutiny.
After the mutiny, exactly. We are very, very careful about the number of Brits that we send over, and we're very careful to basically send them over as administrators and nothing else. So, in historical terms, the huge wave of Indian immigration we've seen coming this way is completely unprecedented. The second point, income aside, is that we're also seeing sectarianism amongst this group. So, people who defend the kind of Cameronite integrationist establishment view will say, well, you don't have the same problems in the Indian community that you have in the Muslim community, because actually we've done a great job with these people. Maybe it's just a particular problem of Islam.
Well, this is Tommy Robinson's line.
This is the Robinson line,
and he's not wrong in that the Sikh and Hindu communities in the UK handled the grooming gangs much better than the white working classes were allowed to organise and combat the problem. But the fact that there is a collective consciousness of a foreign ideology in the country in the first place is something to raise an eyebrow at.
Yes, and we've seen that have an electoral impact now.
Completely.
So
who was that MP who was sworn in on the Baghdad veto?
Bob Blackman.
There you go.
Harrow
in
West.
Yeah, there were a bunch of them that, and you mentioned this in your critic piece, that signed Sikh and Hindu manifestos.
Yes.
And this is something that Rishi Sunak tacitly endorsed when he was it?
It's a policy exchange paper, wasn't it? Or it was a foreword to a policy exchange, something like that.
The Changing Face of
Portrait of Modern Britain.
That was the paper. Yeah.
It was 2014. He said, well, and he gave an interview on Al Jazeera, of all places, just on the Parliament Green over there, saying, well, Conservative politicians at the time might want to take note about the different demographics which are more inclined to vote Conservative than the other. And even though Indian immigrants still voted majority Labour, a larger share of them voted majority Conservative. I'm sure that was Rishi Sunak's only motivation for wanting 1 million Indians in a few years. I'm absolutely sure that's the case, but please continue.
Well, I mean, this is very interesting. So we've just seen the H-1B discussion in America, right? So the topic of Indian immigration is very, very timely.
Explain to our viewers what the H-1B visa system is exactly, because this is a British audience primarily.
Of course. Yeah. So America has a number of different visa routes for what they call skilled migration. The top skilled route is the O1 visa. A vanishingly small number of O1s are given out each year. That's your kind of Ricardo Fermi, Einstein visa route, right? For your top business people, top scientists, whatever. Most people, I think, even the most ardent immigration restrictionists, are happy for a couple of thousand people a year who are very talented and who don't cloister into their own groups to come over and, build rockets or whatever.
Like Elon Musk himself.
The H-1B is a completely different route. The H-1B is the more generalized skilled route visa. Businesses can apply for a certain number of H-1Bs based on their size. It's a lottery-based system, so it's not just a kind of salary cap. I, as a business, might say, well, I want 50 H-1Bs this year. I'm going to put in for 50. Maybe we get 35 of those. It is, in practice, a visa route for Indians to come to the United States. It is used heavily by the tech sector. They're not exclusively. We saw there was some discussion about this over Christmas because...
ruined my Christmas.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. Certain Republican figures were calling for restrictions on the H-1B route because it is used primarily as a means by businesses to avoid domestic hiring restrictions and costs. Instead, they go, okay, we'll just hire him from India. So it's basically the same as people who use Mexican farm laborers, though they put them at computers rather than in the field.
And it codes high skills. And therefore, it has the same reassuring effect in the population at large, which isn't really that well read up on the details as the O1 visa does. And they view it as it's just one below an O1 visa. I'm sure we want these people here. I'm sure they're all building rockets, but in fact...
It's pretty much the same. Most of these people will be coming over and contributing an awful lot. Actually, what they're doing is that they're filling low-end, entry-level positions, which could be filled by domestic workers. One of the key reasons for this, there are two reasons. One is push, one is pull. The pull reason is that businesses essentially get to indenture somebody if they come over on an H-1B. The Native American coder who signs up for a $70,000 a year job when I say Native American, I should be clear here. I mean
native.
A lower end native, exactly. They can move jobs. They can negotiate. They can say, well, Google, you're not paying me enough. I'm going to go to Microsoft. They're going to pay me £100,000, which in America is an entry-level peanuts salary, depressingly. The H-1B can say, well, I'm going to move, and the business goes, okay, so you're going to get deported then. You're going back to India. Right? There's no ability.
The worker has no bargaining power.
The push factor is deliberate Indian government policy. It's a developmentalist policy pursued by the Indian government. The Indian government deliberately overproduces graduates. It then encourages Western, some non-Western, but primarily Western countries, disproportionately Anglosphere countries, to take Indian skilled migration. Just a reminder that only one of India's universities is in the top 500 globally, according to the Times ranking. So we're not talking about kind of subcontinental Oxford and Cambridge here. We're talking about quite low-end university. They deliberately overproduce graduates, particularly in fields that they know that the Anglosphere countries will want. They encourage through government policy. The Indian government has been very muscular in this H-1B debate about saying America must take more H-1Bs. If these were really very skilled people, why would you want to get rid of them? Right? The reality is that they're a remittance route for India. India takes in 180 billion a year in remittances. That's the last year's figure. Last few years have been pretty similar. That's bigger than the GDP of Kenya. So we're talking about an enormous share of Indian GDP, right? They are pushing their graduates out so that they remit back. So just remember that when you're on the tube and you see those remit lists. Right? That's exactly what's going on. This is deliberate Indian government policy.
But God forbid we advertise a burger or a bikini.
Well, it would be horrific. It would be damaging to the national character, obviously. So that's what's going on with Indian migration. To bring it back to the UK, and as you say, there was that Rishi Sunak report there, but this goes back to Cameron. Cameron writes an article, David Cameron, in 2007, where he says maybe the British should be more willing to integrate into the Asian way of life than the Asians into the British.
Well, this was Vivek's argument in his very contentious post. He was disparaging American culture and then implying that the Indian work ethic was somehow more supreme than the Protestant work ethic, which made America an industrial powerhouse. And if only Americans would stop watching Friends reruns or supporting the jocks and Saved by the Bell, then they could all become indentured servants working 80 hours a week and never seeing their blooming family. That's wonderfully desirable to me.
Also, Trevor Phillips recently, after the Southport riots,
David Lammy, yes,
and David Lammy saying that it's not immigrants that need to integrate. We are now a multicultural tapestry, and that it's the native population that doesn't like what's being done to them that needs to integrate. The far right needs to integrate into multicultural Britain.
And John McTernan on Martin Daubney's show as well. This is the new Labour line. Brits must reintegrate back into the ideological Blairite project that we have revolutionised their country into.
Mm-hmm. And the reality, as I touched on in my discussion with Fraser, is that our social model, the Northwest European social model, depends upon a very low level of migration, particularly from outgroups which display a high degree of nepotism or clan or kin consciousness. Mm-hmm. We are fairly unique in global terms. It's really a sort of Dutch, Danish, English thing, in that we have very loose kin structures, right? And thinkers on the conservative right, and this is often why I don't necessarily call myself a small c conservative, go, if only we had more extended family, right? If only we had tighter kin networks. And I understand where that's coming from. I understand the core impetus behind that argument. What that actually produces is
cousin marriage,
right? It produces clan and kin and nepotism. Our system was working fine. The problem with the system is that we've imported people who don't share those norms, and actually in many cases have antithetical norms, who stand to benefit disproportionately from the fact that we are a high trust, meritocratic, relatively low disagreeableness, loose kin structure, right? So if H-1B is another classic example of this. If you put somebody who came to America from India on an H-1B visa in charge of hiring at an American tech firm, the assumptions of all their colleagues will be that the hiring is happening meritocratically, because that is the Anglo-Saxon ideal, is meritocracy. What is actually often going on is nepotism. It's hiring of people from your family, and if not your family, your caste, and if not your caste, your ethnic or religious group.
We've even seen this. There are some civil rights cases being taken. There are civil rights cases being brought against firms with predominantly Indian board membership at the moment for precisely this kind of nepotism. And one of the things that's really insidious about it is that because we, as Anglo-Saxons, we do kind of rest on our givens, as laurels almost, and we assume that because we're acting in a meritocratic fashion, other people are necessarily going to do so. And even if an Indian is recruited on a meritocratic basis in the sense that they're good at their job, it doesn't mean that they don't also harbor nepotistic tendencies, which mean that later down the line, that meritocracy is nowhere to be seen, because it just takes one highly nepotistic person to get his foot in the door on a meritocratic basis, and then the whole ethos of the organization, over time at least, if they're sort of successively recruiting according to ethnic preferences, and all of a sudden that whole meritocratic culture dies. It's not a self-sustaining phenomenon.
Well, the perfect example of this is Priti Patel in 2021. There was an article in The Critic also on the legal mechanisms by which the Boris wave was achieved, and it cited a 2021 Foreign Affairs meeting where Priti Patel said, yeah, we're using Indian migration to achieve our foreign policy goals. And it's like, right, okay, well, why have you got a particular interest in fostering good community relations with the entire nation of India? Pretty right. We are still operating on a very individualistic paradigm, which is particular to the English-speaking world and Northwest Europe, and then admitting tribal, ethno-religious, preferential political figures into that structure, and then we're completely blindsided when they have loyalties which lie outside of the UK.
And we spot this when it's Mirpuri grooming gangs, right? Mm-hmm. Even if we're not allowed necessarily to talk about it, we do spot it. I'm much more worried in the long run about skilled migration than unskilled. Mm-hmm. There will always be a good political case for saying if you earn very little money and you commit crime, we should get rid of you. There will always be a case for that, right? It's very easy to sell the public on it. It's much harder to sit here and have this kind of conversation with the public where you're saying that alignment is more important than ability. Mm. It's much more difficult to do, but it's much more important because those people wield political capital, right? Based on size of community, we should have we have a fairly close relationship with Pakistan, but we should have a very close relationship with that country, right? But actually that community has been pretty bad about fostering links, at least at the diplomatic governmental level. What links do exist are largely a kind of relic of British Cold War policy in which we were very, very interested in what was going on in Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, etc. With India, they've been very successful, right? We talk every couple of years about a renaissance in our relationship with India, about how Modi's India is on the global stage, world's largest democracy, Britain's going to be a great partner in Asia, we're going to do great things. One, this is nonsense. It's totally untrue. The Indians barely think about Britain at all, except as a kind of source of resentment. Core to the governing ideology of Narendra Modi and the Hindutva ideology to which he subscribes is anti-British sentiment.
Just read the Hindustan Times and it comes across.
Yeah, yes. The whole worldview of Modi and his party is that Hindu civilization is great, uniquely so, right? They invented everything. Online Indians have done great damage to India's global reputation. Some of the claims about what Indians have invented, right? Knife and fork, the number zero.
Not slobbering, though.
And the Muslims are number one. They're number one enemy. They kept the Indians down for a very long time, right? The Mughals came in, or rather the Delhi Sultanate came in the 1200s, and then the Mughals followed on this later, right? Two Persianate Muslim dynasties. We're enemy number two. We kept them down for a shorter period of time when we were probably nicer about it, but we're still in the firing line. And figures in Modi's government have been very aggressive in saying we need to expunge English from India. We need to expunge often Christians from India, right? There are communal burnings of Christians in parts of India because Christians are seen as a sign of European civilization when actually they should just be re-embracing their Hindu roots. So we're not ideologically aligned with India whatsoever. India also deals with whoever it wants, right? India is not some ready-made part of the kind of Anglophone liberal democratic world.
They're a member of BRICS.
Precisely. And trade with Russia, trade with China, more power to them. I wish we had a foreign policy that was more pragmatic, right? I'm not saying we should do anything with India or China or Russia in particular. We should be more self-interested, right? I wish we were more like Turkey or India in this respect, that they're very good at standing up for their interests. But their interests are certainly not ours, right? We don't share a great deal of strategic interest with India. So even if we take away all the points that we've just made about the economic case being wrong, the sectarian politics being damaging, the immigration policy being undesirable. Is it desirable that we shape any of our policy around a particular friendship with India? I would say no. Right? But this at every level is what's happening. And it's partly because Anglophone conservatives have been blind to the downsides of Indian skilled migration.
Well, Sam, I'm glad that we've managed to broaden the discussion of immigration to encompass multiple different forms of indigestible identity rather than Islam, which is, of course, in the news at the moment. So thank you very much for joining us. We do have some questions for you that have been sent in by our studious audience for the exclusive members section only. But thank you for coming on for now. Thank you as well, Connor. If you want to stick around for the NCF Extra members section, make sure to sign up. Otherwise, make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.